At first, it looks like weather-long white seams stitched across a blue February sky. What a farmer near Braunschweig sees on the morning of February 20th, 1944, are not clouds, but contrails, dozens upon dozens, a ghostly grid sliding east. At 25,000 feet, the air is too cold to remember kindness. Oxygen hisses through rubber masks. Aluminum shivers. The United States 8th Air Force is coming on in the daylight again, not as a dare, but as a plan. And this time, the plan includes company that can go the distance. On the ground, sirens. In the Reich's defensive belt, colored flares arc above airfields like tiny orders written in fire. Alarm start scramble. Pilots run, boots thudding on boards laid down over winter mud. A mechanic slaps the cowling of a Messerschmitt as if that could help it start. A hand swings the prop through. Magnetos on. The Bf-109 coughs, then settles into an oily, high-strung growl. The squadron's leader, tired, 30, older than his men by a few hard years, slides the canopy forward and feels the glass stick for half a second on frost. His lungs remember last summer's smell of pine and kerosene. His eyes move once to a photo clipped to the panel. Then he is rolling, the grass a blur, the engine pulling hard enough to make his heart beat behind it. Up there, a navigator named Frank, 24, from Ohio, rubs a pencil point against the kneeboard strapped over his fleece-lined pants. He has drawn the line from the Dutch coast to a name he'd never heard until yesterday. Oschersleben, Leipzig, Bernburg, Erla, Junkers, Ago. The briefers had pointed at photographs' roof lines, sheds, assembly halls, the lattice of rail spurs, and had spoken the new arithmetic. Factories building fighters create fighters that kill bombers that stop factories. Today is not about bridges or depots. Today is about the Luftwaffe itself. Between them move the shapes that will write the day fighter escorts with names that sound like dance steps and knife strokes. Thunderbolts, lightnings, and above all Mustangs. The P-51 is a paradox in aluminum. An American airframe married to a British heart. The Rolls-Royce Merlin built under license by Packard in Detroit. It flies like a thought and drinks from cheap, glue-impregnated paper tanks that will drop away somewhere over Saxony. Until recently, fighters could not stay with the bombers to their targets and back. They turned for home, and the German fighters came then, like wolves finding the edge of a herd. That edge is gone this morning. In a room in High Wycombe, England, insulated against a winter it can't quite keep out, James Jimmy Doolittle, who once flew a pencil sketch of a plan off a carrier deck to wake a sleeping giant, leans over the map. It is his 8th Air Force now. He has already changed a sentence that will change the sky. Escorts are no longer chained to the bombers. Fighter pilots will be fighter pilots. Not nurses go out, sweep ahead, take the Luftwaffe apart. On another map, in another room, in Naples, the 15th Air Force will push north from Italy. Operation Argument, the staff named it. Later, they'll call this week Big Week, as if saying it simply made it so. In Berlin, a minister looks out at air that for months has been a kind of warning, crossed by lines of white too high to hear. Spears charts show production rising, more Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs every month. More engines packed into crates, numbers like a shield. He knows, as men who juggle knives do, that numbers can cut. Factories can be dispersed, hammered in clusters, bombed by night by the RAF, and by day by Americans. What he cannot fix with a chart is petrol that isn't there, pilots who can't be trained to the old standards, and a sky that is becoming a place the Reich can no longer own at noon. We like our turning points clean. The truth is messier. An empire's grip loosens not in a theatrical moment, but in a series of things that look like ordinary days. A room where a commander changes a rule. A hangar where fuel drums are only half full. A training syllabus quietly cut from 200 hours to less than half. A factory moved to a forest. A mechanic who doesn't sleep. And still, we search for a day and image that can carry the weight of a phrase. If there is such a day for the Luftwaffe, if there is a morning when its air supremacy begins to bleed out in a way that cannot be staunched, it looks like this. A tide of silver, a fringe of dark, fast shapes, a tangle of contrails and tracer, and underneath, the German fighter on rising to defend a nation that taught it to believe it could never lose the sky. The first interception will come west of the target belt. Controllers' vector units like chess pieces. Bandits 2 o'clock high. The Luftwaffe will try head-on attacks taught by aces who learn to survive the motes of bomber fire coming fast. Nose to nose, guns timed, and nerves made of taut leather. A storm group waits farther back. FW-190s fat with armor and 30mm cannons, built to chew bombers into shrapnel. Behind them, the twin-engined Zersterer BF-110s and B-410s carry rockets that startle but don't aim well. For months this grim ballet has worked often enough. Today the partners have changed. Frank glances out his window and sees them specs first, then fighters with the swagger of speed. Relief hits like warmth. Our little friends. A Mustang rockets past, white spinner, black canopy glint, a blur of invasion stripes not yet painted this winter. The pilot's gloved hand lifts in a wave and is gone. A word crackles over a frequency Frank isn't supposed to use and sometimes does anyway. Tally-ho. On a grass strip near Hanover, a German pilot watches the Mustangs slice into the climbing Messerschmitts the way quick water cuts a standing wave. He is not afraid yet. Trained reflex has no time for fear. He rolls, pulls into the sun, scans for the shadow that means death. In the seconds he does not find it, he sees something else. American fighters too deep, too many, too eager. If the bombers are bait, then he is the fish. He has been alive this long by refusing to imagine that anyone has come to kill him specifically. Today, looking over his shoulder through the mist of his own breath, he understands the new rule and puts the nose down. Call it symmetry, a winter morning that carries within it both the fight and its future. Above a city whose factories cut aircraft frames from sheet aluminum, as if they were fabric, fighters crash together in a curdled cloud. In an RAF ops room across the channel, boards flip from out to engaged. In a German flak battery outside Leipzig, gunners look up with the baffled awe of men who pick up stones in a flood. The day is already working on them, on their fleet, on their faith in how the war works. It is a day that will not announce itself as decisive, but when it is over, and the week with it, the Luftwaffe will be different, smaller, where it cannot afford to be, larger in all the wrong places. A bomber crewman watches the shadow of his own ship slide over a quilt of fields. He makes a quiet promise that superstition says you never speak aloud. Get me through this one, and you can do what you want. A German controller taps ash into a tray and tells a voice in his ear to climb, and then to break right, and then to break left, and then silence. In that small hush where one voice used to be, you can hear a thing larger than a dogfight, larger than a mission, larger than any of the names men have painted under cockpits. The Luftwaffe is beginning to lose a battle it once believed it could not lose. The day is less a fall than the start of a long, irreversible slide. Before this morning, there were other skies. In 1939 and 1940, the Luftwaffe cut channels through Poland and France with a craftsmanship that looked like inevitability. Ru-87 Stukas screamed down like falling iron, close support doctrine and radio discipline, making mud and panic out of places that a week before had been villages. The Army and Air Force moved like a hand with all fingers working. Over the Channel in 1940, the first hint came that the Luftwaffe was not invincible. The Battle of Britain put English pilots and planes between bombers and cities, and though the RAF bled, it did not break. There's a way to trace a line from September 15, 1940, the day Londoners watched dogfights from rooftops and heard Churchill's tired voice declare a fight won, to this winter morning. But after 1940, the Luftwaffe still owned many skies. Over the Balkans, above Crete, at the start over Russia, when fields and men burned under summer sun. Time writes its corrections slowly. The Eastern Front ate airframes and pilots the way it ate men and tanks. By 1942 and 1943, the Luftwaffe learned new words: attrition, dispersal, starvation. Fuel that had been taken for granted became a ration. Training salabi grew thinner. In 1939, a fighter pilot might tally more than 200 hours before combat. In 1944, many would climb into their first real fight with a fraction of that and an instructor's last words like a prayer. Spear's reforms raised production curves, yes, but you cannot bolt experience into a cockpit. Across the Channel, and then across an ocean, another air war was being assembled. The RAF had gone to night to survive and to hit. Bomber Command's nights were brutal and controversial, their city fires seen from 100 miles away by men who would argue for and against them until they died. The Americans wanted daylight. They brought Norden bomb sights and a belief in precision, and B-17s and B-24s that looked like barns until you saw them in a formation. And then they looked like a moving cathedral, a woven thing of aluminum and .50 caliber gun barrels and discipline. In August and October of 1943, they tried to prove that idea beyond escort range over Regensburg and Schweinfurt, and the Luftwaffe met them with speed and mass and well-taught anger. Those missions carry names in American memory that taste like iron. The Regensburg Shuttle, the Schweinfurt-Regensburg Raids, Black Thursday. The Butcher's Bill broke faith. The 8th Air Force reeled. War is a time machine that asks men to learn fast. While new bombers filled English fields, engineers and planners set about solving the escort problem. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a blunt, tough fighter, did hard work in 1943, but even with dropped tanks, it could not always get to the target and back. The twin-engine P-38 Lightning ranged farther, but high and deep into winter, it could be a fickle friend. And then the P-51 arrived with its Merlin engine, a long-legged sprinter that could leap with the bombers to Berlin and home again if you hung barrels under its wings and gave it the right orders. Orders matter. In January 1944, Doolittle took over the 8th from IRA Eaker. He did not bring bigger planes or more pilots. He brought a shift in permission. Close escort, a fighter tucked along a bomber's wingtip, looked like chivalry, but worked like a leash. Doolittle took it off. Escorts would roam, sweep ahead, hunt behind, turn back to slash at the interceptors forming like storm cells. Aerodrones would be fair game on the way out and on the way home. Tires and tin peeled off the Luftwaffe's morning, even when the bombers were hours away. Dug out of the rigid habits of 1943, fighter pilots rediscovered something primal. Give us freedom, and we will go find the fight for you. In German-ready rooms, men hung flight leathers over radiators and pretended that the smell of steam could make them warmer. The Reichsday fighters, the Reichsverteidigung, had become a nation's last argument with the sky. Commanders taught their young men what Egon Meyer and others had learned: to come in from the front, because B-17s and B-24s were porcupines backward, to aim for the cockpits, to fire in short, disciplined bursts, to punch through a formation and live to climb and turn and do it again. Storm groups, Sturmgruppen, were created with armor bolted onto Focke-Wulfs and thick-barrel cannons to walk shells across the bodies of bombers. The twin-engine destroyers, once proud, had become reluctant, bullied into head-on passes when they could find space and pushed aside by escorts when they could not. In the factories that made this dance possible, the transformation had a texture. Women riveted, boys fetched. Engineers wrapped jigs in tarps and walked them to woods where plywood sheds wore. Trees as camouflage and roofs were spaced to look from above like farmland. A Junkers plant in Bernburg, an Erla works in Leipzig, the Ego factory at Oschersleben. All had multiplied their locations like seeds after a hard wind. The RAF had taught them about night. The Americans had taught them about day. Industry became a creature with many limbs. So when Operation Argument finally shook itself free of weather and uncertainty in late February, it arranged to put pressure on all the points at once. 8th Air Force in England would go for Central German Aircraft Works, Leipzig's engine and airframe plants, Bernburg's assembly halls, Oschersleben's Ego lines, Gotha's wagons turned to war. 15th Air Force, out of Italy, would reach north against Regensburg and Wiener Neustadt in the southern spokes. If the Luftwaffe stayed on the ground, factories would burn. If it rose, it would meet a kind of escort it had not faced before above its own house. The day breaks with very human details. A Mustang pilot tapes a snapshot of home to a gun sight. A German crew chief listens for the exact way an engine catches and knows before the gauges say it whether the mixture is right. In an American mess, a man eats eggs without tasting them and wonders if he will ever taste anything again that isn't mixed with cold fear. A woman in Leipzig, just reporting to the day shift, hears the sirens and thinks first stupidly of something she left on the stove, and then of where the shelter is now, the new one, not the one that was crushed last month when the 500-pounder found the angle it liked. Somewhere under all that, there's the arithmetic back in London and Washington and Berlin. How many fighters can the Luftwaffe lose before the rate of replacement pilots, engines, airframes falls behind the appetite? How many crews can the 8th lose before it breaks the men who fly it? Which curve meets which first? The men strapped to their machines on this morning will make those curves real. One trigger squeeze, one fireball, one return to base with holes like a constellation in a wing. It is not a romantic arithmetic. It does not love anyone. But it does mean this. There are days when the graph changes direction. A morning with too many contrails above Saxony is one of them. If you could zoom in on the hour when the formations crossed the German frontier, you would see a choreography composed of both doctrine and panic. The bomber box tight and layered, guns covering arcs like a hedgehog moved at a stately speed, the way a floating city moves. The escorts floated around it, like small, angry fish. The Luftwaffe climbed. Controllers sought height advantage, timing and space, the necessary geometry to create a good head-on pass. First contact is a memory that every pilot hears in a different register. For a bomber waist gunner, it's the silver needle of a 109 sliding down the meridian of your fear, the steady blink of muzzle flash, the miniature twinkling explosion as a 20-millimeter shell finds aluminum and then a man. For a Mustang driver-up son of a climbing pair, it's a flash of color, a guess that turns into a certainty, a decision to believe that your speed is enough, and your enemy will keep climbing instead of turning to meet you. The sky fills with scratches tracer lines that look, from a distance, like children drawing with sparklers. Doolittle's change shows its teeth early. Instead of sitting guard at a bomber's elbow, the escorts rise and spool forward. Groups take turns leading so that someone always has fuel to fight. Thunderbolts, big, blunt, and brave tumble into BF-110s, who years earlier would have hunted bombers with swagger, and now die like old men surprised in alleys. Lightnings find scenes of their own, but it's the Mustangs that write the day's scar stories on both sides. They are fast, they can climb with the enemy, and they are everywhere. A Luftwaffe pilot who breaks through the escort to line up on a bomber finds another American fighter suddenly in love with him personally. Even among fighters, there are customs. Some German aces ship to the Eastern Front to score numbers. Others stay in the West, where the work is harder and the enemy fights back in every language of speed. These men knew what they faced in 1943. Unescorted bomber streams, deadly, yes, but manageable with patience and discipline. Now the sky has turned layered. The bombers overhead, and below them, above them, ahead and behind, Americans who do not have to ask permission to chase you down. When a 190 pilot levels after a pass to accelerate and climb, a Mustang drops its tanks and a rise on his shoulder like a hand, and you learn very quickly whether your instructor was right about that particular turn you never quite mastered. Over Oschersleben, the Ego plant takes its hits, glass and brick and metal collapsing in an argument they can't win with 100 hammers. Over Bernburg, the Junkers halls fill with dust, and women taste grit and say names under their breath. At Erla in Leipzig, the buildings that make Messerschmitts are mapped from above and then erased. If you want surprising facts, take this one. The German aircraft industry will produce more machines in 1944 than in any year before it, even as these raids and raids like them peel its skin and bruise its organs. There will be planes. There will be engines. There will not be pilots with hours in the air, and there will not be fuel to teach or fight or ferry, and that is how Supremacy turns into a museum exhibit. The Luftwaffe tries everything it built for this fight. Head-on passes led by men who know how not to blink. Sturmstaffel pilots in armored FW-190s pushing into bomber formation too close to turn back in time. Pilots carrying rockets WGR-21 tubes under their wings firing salvos meant to break a box to make spaces that friend and foe can fall through. None of this stops being dangerous. Bombers go down. Crews die, sometimes all at once, sometimes in slow, brave sears of fire as men count to 3 and drop. But the interception timetable, the sacred sequence of climb, hit, reform, and hit again, is being shattered by escorts who do not care about your sequence. They are ahead when you meant to be ahead. They are behind when you meant to be safe. They make your map wrong. On the ground, the impact is more literal. A young apprentice, pressed into a shadow factory, set up in a school gymnasium outside Leipzig, stares at a wing section that now looks like something from a shipwreck. He thinks of the word supremacy without saying it, just as his foreman thinks of the word tomorrow, and wonders which of his machines will still be there to use. In a farmhouse miles away, a girl watches strands of cloud that are not clouds and imagines them as ladders. She counts the fireflies drifting down from those lines and does not realize for another year that they are men with parachutes. In the afternoon, after what feels like a month compressed into 4 hours, the tide shifts in a way that the Luftwaffe will later feel in its bones. Many of its experienced men are dead or wounded. Others have landed to refuel and rearm, and the fields they use suddenly die under strafing passes. The new doctrine hit them on the ground was anathema to some in 1943, a gentleman's distaste for shooting a man who cannot shoot back. In 1944, no one in a P-51 buzzing a German field at mast height after watching B-17s burn is a gentleman. Gun camera film from that week looks like a dark harvest plains blossoming into flame, one after another along a turf line. A mechanic flinging himself flat. A truck jackknifing. A pilot running from a cockpit that slurps smoke from its own open canopy. Big week is not one day, but the first day tells the story the others repeat. On the 24th, Americans loop back to Schweinfurt, this time with teeth all the way. Losses do not vanish, but their balance changes. The bomber stream returns with fewer gaps where ships were. The Luftwaffe loses machines it can count and men it cannot replace in time. On the 25th, the largest push strikes against Regensburg and Augsburg, against Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf's beating hearts. From Italy, the 5th finds Wiener Neustadt. From England, the 8th paints a belt of destruction through central Germany. Names drop onto the map like stones thrown into water, whose ripples we can still see. The week ends not with a trumpet, but with exhaustion. American crews count the empty bunks in their huts, and sick with hands that will not stop shaking. German wings chalk up claims and losses, and a staff officer carries those numbers down a hall to a commander who already knows what they mean. If you want a sentence blunt enough to fit on a page, try this. In 1 week, the Luftwaffe's day fighter force lost a critical fraction of its trained men, found that it could no longer separate bombers from fighters, and discovered that defending a nation in daylight would from now on be a job done in smaller, bloodier pieces than it could afford. Air supremacy is not a medal you hang in a case. It is a habit the sky has of yielding to you. In late February 1944, that habit broke. The way history sometimes gets told, spring follows big week, and all at once the Luftwaffe is a ghost. That's neat and incorrect. They keep fighting. Tactics adapt. Units reform. Germany puts more planes on the line. But there's a difference between activity and control. After February 1944, the Reich's day firearm is in a fight it cannot win, and most of what follows are acts that make that loss visible. You can see it in the raids that come next. In March, for the first time, the 8th goes for Berlin in daylight. The Luftwaffe throws everything. The sky between Magdeburg and the city's western beltways becomes a set piece, contrails shredded, cannon strikes looking like a storm in slow motion. The Americans pay, they always pay, but the escort doctrine holds. The Mustangs, P-47s, and Lightnings keep finding the German formations before they can find the bombers. Keep stalking them home. The climactic achievement is not an American bomb load, buried in the city's industrial ribs. It is the site of the Luftwaffe's best pilots. When they land, looking around for squadron mates who do not taxi in. You can see it in June, on the beaches of Normandy. We talk rightly about the ships and men who turn the water white with their wakes. But look up at the air above the invasion. It belongs to the Allies almost absolutely. The Luftwaffe flies a handful of sorties at morning and day, brave and long in memory because they are lonely. A pilot in a FW-190 who streaks over Sword Beach, drops his bombs, and vanishes becomes famous because it is the exception. The rest is Allied. Fighters describe circles above the sand. Fighter bombers nail columns on roads, miles behind the bocage, while naval guns make rain out of clay. At English airfields, fuel trucks line up like cows at milking to keep the machine going. At German fields, the ground crew look at the gauge and look at each other and say less each day. If you want a number to taste with caution, consider pilot training hours. Early in the war, a German fighter pilot might see 240 flight hours before combat. By 1944, shortages and urgency have cut that by more than half, then more. Some boys take a Focke-Wulf or Messerschmitt into a fight with less than 100 hours total and mere single digits on the type. They are thrown against men whose instructors survived 1943 and now teach ruthlessness as craft. The Luftwaffe still has aces whose boards are scarred with chalk marks. Men who can land in crosswinds and thread through tracer like a seamstress threading a needle. But around them are rookies, keen-eyed and doomed, climbing for the first time into a sky that now punishes in daylight. The oil campaign closes its fist. Beginning in May 1944, the Allies hit synthetic fuel plants, the hydrogenation and Fischer-Tropsch, palaces that make gasoline and aviation fuel out of coal. If aircraft plants were the bones, oil is the blood. Without it, training shrivels, sorties vanish, engines seize in the air. This is when reality becomes vulgar. The Luftwaffe starts to park more planes than it flies. An eyed pilot looking down sees perfect ducks and dives to shoot them. A German commander saves fuel for a promised counterstroke that keeps being postponed into a future that the front lines make smaller every week. Yet the Luftwaffe tries. It conjures Sturmgruppen of FW-190A 8R2S with armor plates nailed everywhere you can nail steel. Pilots who swear oaths to fly into bomber formations and not break off until within gun range, even when that means your canopy fills with aluminum and fire and pieces of strangers. It brings out the ME-410, heavy and elegant, loaded with 50mm cannons that can end a bomber's day with one round, assuming you can live long enough to get close. It puts boys in BF-109 G6S with bulges over the guns and hopes that the kind of courage that does not know better is enough. By autumn, thunder has a different timbre. The sky over Germany is an Allied workplace. The 9th Air Force follows the front with fighter bombers. The RAV's 2nd TAF hammers road and rail. The 8th and 15th continue to press, not only on aircraft plants now, but on everything that lets a modern state stay modern. Rail marshalling yards, bridges, communications, the web. The Luftwaffe still has sharp days in September and November, whenever weather or routes trap bomber streams in ways you can game if you're clever. It still has teeth at night, where the Kammhuber line has adjusted, and men like Heinz Wolfgang Stauffer still carve their tallies. But supremacy, the sense that daylight above your own heartland belongs to you if you want, has gone. In the last winter, there is an act that feels like a confession. On January 1st, 1945, the Luftwaffe lifts almost everything that can fly for Operation Bodenplatte, a low-level New Year's surprise meant to erase Allied aircraft from forward airfields in the Low Countries. It is daring, violent, and full of the old gift for choreography. It is also sabotage by hope. The attack destroys hundreds of Allied aircraft, many on the ground. Yet it costs the Luftwaffe far more planes and, worse, pilots. Some of its own flak shoots its boys down, not warned of the plan. The units that limp home are shadows. A few days later, when German ground forces around the bulge need eyes and claws in the air, there is very little left to send. Somewhere in these months, you meet individuals who carry the story in their bodies. A German pilot in his teens with a few hours and a 190 writes a letter home about the way the frost looks on the runway at dawn and the way a Mustang's wing seems to slide across the sky instead of cut it. An American crew chief with grease in his fingerprints for life moves along a line of P-51s and Pats, metal like horses, counting each bird the way a shepherd counts sheep at dusk. A woman whose lungs will always carry a thin film of dust walks past a crumpled truss at an aircraft plant and decides, politely and forever, that she will not remember the smell of cordite mixed with chalk. The Me-262 jet appears at the edges, a shark in a pond. It is fast enough to make today into tomorrow in a heartbeat, able to move through a formation before a gunner can react. But it arrives late and in dribbles, and a leader who loves roles and theater holds it back for reasons of doctrine and pride. Fuel is rare. Runways are targets. The jets become a coda, divided between brilliance and vulnerability, impressive and impotent in equal measure. A photograph, a Mustang parked under the wing of a captured 262, tells the whole story. New and newer, old rules and new physics, both anchored to Earth by circumstances older than machines. The Luftwaffe will not stop being brave. It stops being dominant. If you want to argue that it lost its air supremacy earlier, you can. Make a case for September 1940 over the Channel, when Britain did not fold. Make a case for Stalingrad, where transport pilots flew into a cauldron without relief. Make a case for any day in 1943 when the West discovered the price of daylight and paid it anyway. But if you want to name a day when the German fighter arm began a slide that no tactic or production trick or last gamble could arrest, you could choose the Sunday in February when Big Week opened and 100 Contrails looked down on Oschersleben and Leipzig like chalk lines on a blackboard that someone was about to wipe clean. Walk out under a winter sky and tilt your head until your neck aches. Try to imagine the sound. You won't hear it, not as they did. The high rasp of turbos, the popping crack of guns that sound almost small, until you remember what their bullets do to flesh. What you might feel is something quieter, the weight of choices that turn machines into instruments of policy, and policy into the shape of a day that lives on in records and men's bones. The day the Luftwaffe lost its air supremacy is both a day and a week, both a sky and a system. It is the visible tip of a long hidden structure of causes. Strategy matters. A decision to hit aircraft plants as if they were closets full of swords, a choice to risk daylight because you believed in what daylight can do to aim and morale. Technology matters. A Merlin in an American body that let a fighter fly to Berlin and back with just enough fuel to fight the fight that mattered. Leadership matters. A general willing to cut a leash and tell boys with confidence and narrow hearts to go find and destroy other boys in other cockpits. And all of that rides on things less clean. Coal turned into gasoline at factories ringed with flak. The ability of a country to teach its young to fly without killing them in the teaching. The way a nation's industry can keep making things while boxes fall from a high silver table. We make myths out of machines because they are easier to love than the arithmetic. The Mustang becomes a savior. The Messerschmitt becomes a villain's car. In truth, they are vehicles for the hands inside them. The men of the Jagdwaffe were not abstractions. They were professionals trained in a system that had served them until it did not, that had wedded loyalty to a state with loyalty to craft. The boys in American jackets were not all exemplars of a national myth. They were farmers and clerks and ex-bicycle mechanics strapped into high-pressure chambers, fighting fear and cold, and the sense that the universe had narrowed to a pair of hands gripping a yoke and a little knob of a throttle. Between them are those on the ground, the riveters and the mechanics, and the women and men who went down into shelters and came up to brick dust and said nothing because there was nothing to say. What does it mean to say, lost its air supremacy? It means more than failing to appear over a beachhead. It means a strategic condition turned around. It means that the Germans could no longer dictate turns in their own daylight, that the Americans and British could plan and execute raids, knowing the probability of return moved from catastrophic to difficult to, in time, routine. It meant that by summer and autumn of 1944, the Allied armies on the ground moved under an umbrella that mostly did not leak. And it meant that when Germany tried last blows armored fists against thin lines in the Ardennes, low-level surprises on New Year's morning, they could not cloak those movements in the old way. Sky and space had been lost to them. There is a lesson here that resists cheerleading. Air supremacy is not romantic. It is an outcome of industrial stamina, training pipelines, logistics, doctrine, and the willingness to take horror and turn it into pressure. When we talk about precision, we must say also attrition. When we talk about the clean lines of a fighter's silhouette at dusk, we must say also the broken lines in a ledger where a commander looks and knows that the number of experienced men he has left cannot carry the next month. The Allies did not win the air war only because they had better planes or more of them. They won because they could afford not only to lose, but to learn, to change doctrine faster than their opponent could regenerate skill, to fuel training flights enough times that a boy's hands were no longer surprised by a stall. The end of the Luftwaffe's supremacy is not a place to gloat. It is a place to remember how fragile such dominance always is, even when it looks total. In another war, with another balance, the arrows on the map could point the other way. That is why the story matters now, not as a hymn to a machine or a way of fighting, but as a study in how choices, technology, and ethics combine. Doolittle's decision to unleash his escorts was tactical and brutal. It also saved lives by shortening the time men flew unprotected. Allied decisions to hit oil were devastating to civilians. They also forced an enemy's hand more surely than any romance about duels could. The Luftwaffe's choice to press boys into cockpits when it could not train them properly was predictable and tragic. All of those belong in the same frame. If there is a call in this history, it is to take air power out of the realm of magic tricks and keep it where it belongs, in the hard, transparent light of planning, consequence, and law. To admire craft without making it a cult. To teach young officers that doctrine is moral as well as tactical when you unchain escorts you are not just choosing efficiency. You are choosing how men will die and live. To remember that industrial systems do not only produce planes, they produce choices. To keep asking whether supremacy is a goal or a means, and to define what we think victory should look like before we write plans that drop clouds of white lines on another blue sky. Back on that February morning, after the contrails drift apart and the sound drains out, and the ground crews step from the dispersals into the kind of silence that makes a person breathe too loudly, a German pilot sits on the edge of a bunk and studies his hands. He cannot quite make them stop, not yet. He is thinking about a past that went wrong and a Mustang that came from the son and a friend who did not answer on the radio after a joke. He is not thinking about supremacy. He is thinking, very simply, about whether tomorrow will look like today. It will, and it won't. The shape of his struggle has changed, and he will spend the rest of the war inside that change. Years later, a visitor stands at the edge of a memorial in a small town near Oschersleben and reads names. Another walks through an American cemetery in Cambridge, England, where rows and rows face west. If you look up on a cold day when the air draws lines, you can still, sometimes, see a sky crisscrossed with white and think of a week when those lines carried a decision. Big Week broke the Luftwaffe's habit of owning the day. The day that habit broke is not a moment you can bottle. It is a story you tell with care, because care is what keeps history from becoming a caricature of its own victories. Remember that. Not for the sake of a plane or a field or a uniform, for the sake of understanding how power lives and dies above our heads, and how people ordinary, terrified, skilled, stubborn become the instruments by which the air, for a time, belongs to one side more than the other. Then remember what to do with that understanding. Make plans that are as hard on your hopes as they are on the enemy's machines, and draw your lines in the sky only when you fought as hard about their shadows as about their shine.